Hello, I am Bruce, and thank you for watching another video of Congress Weekly. This video is a special edition. I normally cover bills and news within Congress and the President. Instead, I will discuss a possible theory into the origins of COVID-19. There have been several theories. This is just one of them. Most of what I will cover was researched and written by Josh Rogin, but I add my input throughout to include some editing of his article. The purpose of covering this topic is hopefully someday Congress will really focus on this pandemic to possibly find ways for it to never happen again, or at least on this scale, especially since Congress approved so far $6 trillion of our tax dollars to keep our economy afloat because of COVID. The following information is, in my opinion, worth hearing. Again, it is a theory, and to this day, we do not know for certain how COVID-19 really got started, but this is one theory to consider. Back on January 15th of this year, in its last days, President Trump's State Department put out a statement with serious claims about the origins of COVID-19 pandemic. The statement said the U.S. intelligence community had evidence that several researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, otherwise known as the WIV laboratory, were sick with COVID-like symptoms in autumn of 2019, implying the Chinese government had hidden crucial information about the outbreak for months, and that the WIV lab, despite presenting itself as a civilian institution, was conducting secret research projects with the Chinese military. The State Department alleged a Chinese government cover-up and asserted that Beijing continues today to withhold vital information. Again, this is only a theory. The exact origin of the new coronavirus remains a mystery to this day, but the search for answers is not just about assigning blame. Unless the source is located, the true path of the virus can't be traced, and scientists can't properly study the best ways to prevent future outbreaks. The original Chinese government story that the pandemic spread from a seafood market in Wuhan was first and therefore most widely accepted theory. But cracks in that theory slowly emerged throughout the late winter and spring of 2020. The first known case of COVID-19 in Wuhan, it was revealed in February of 2020, had no connection to the market. The Chinese government closed the market in January and sanitized it before proper samples could be taken. It wouldn't be until May of 2020 that the Chinese Centers for Disease Control disavowed the market theory, admitting it had no idea how the outbreak began. But by then, it had become the story of record in China and internationally. In the spring of 2020, inside the U.S. government, some officials began to see and collect evidence of a different, perhaps more troubling theory, that the outbreak had a connection to one of the laboratories in Wuhan, among them the WIV, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a world leading center of research on bat coronaviruses. To a few people inside our government, the name of the laboratory was familiar. Its research on bat viruses had already drawn the attention of U.S. diplomats and officials at the Beijing embassy as early as late 2017, prompting the U.S. Democrats to alert Washington, D.C., that the lab's own scientists had reported a serious shortage of appropriately trained technicians and investigators needed to safely operate this high-containment laboratory. When warnings were published in April of 2020, they added fuel to a debate that had already gone from a scientific and forensic question to a hot-button political issue. President Trump then said he was investigating, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called on Beijing to come clean about the origin of the outbreak. 2 weeks later, Secretary Pompeo said there was enormous evidence pointing to the lab, but he didn't provide any evidence. As President Trump and the Chinese president's relationship unraveled and the administration officials openly blamed the Wuhan lab, the U.S.-China relationship only went further downhill. As the pandemic set in worldwide, the origin story was largely set aside in the public coverage of the crisis, but the internal government debate continued, now over whether the United States should release more information about what it knew about the lab and its possible connection to the outbreak. The public statement in April of 2020 was cleared by the intelligence community, but the underlying data was still held secret. Likely changing no minds, it was meant as a signal, showing that circumstantial evidence did exist and that the theory deserved further investigation. But more than 4 years ago, in 2017, long before this question blew up into an international point of tension between China and the United States, the story started with a simple warning. So let's wind the clock back to late 2017. Top health officials and science officials at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing attended a conference in the Chinese capital. There, they saw a presentation on a new study conducted by a group of Chinese scientists, including several from the Wuhan lab, in conjunction with the U.S. National Institutes of Health, and I'll cover this group a little later in the video. Since the 2002 outbreak of SARS, which is the severe acute respiratory syndrome, which emerged in China and spread to 4 other countries, and fortunately it didn't take long to contain it, is a deadly disease caused by a coronavirus transmitted by bats in China. And scientists around the world had begun looking for ways to predict and limit future outbreaks of similar diseases. To aid the research effort, there are 27 institutes and centers across the United States that make up the National Institutes of Health, which is our nation's medical research agency supporting scientific studies that turn discovery into health. Had funded a number of projects that involve the WIV scientists in China. This funding included much of the Wuhan lab's work with bat coronaviruses. The researchers had found a population of bats from caves in Yunnan province, which is located in southwestern China, that gave them insight into how SARS coronaviruses originated and spread. The researchers boasted that they may have found the cave where the original SARS coronavirus originated. But all the U.S. diplomats cared about was that these scientists had discovered 3 new viruses that had unique characteristics. They contained a spike protein that was particularly good at grabbing on to a specific receptor in human lung cells known as an ACE2 receptor. That means that the viruses were potentially very dangerous for humans, and that these viruses were now in a lab which the U.S. diplomats, were largely unfamiliar. Knowing the significance of the Wuhan discovery and knowing what the WIV's top-level biosafety laboratory was relatively new, the U.S. Embassy health and science officials in Beijing decided to go to Wuhan to check it out. In total, the embassy sent 3 teams of experts in late 2017 and early 2018 to meet with the WIV scientists, among them Shih-Hei Li, often referred to as the Batwoman because of her extensive experience studying coronaviruses found in bats. When our officials sat down with the scientists at the WIV, the American diplomats were shocked by what they heard. The Chinese researchers told them they didn't have enough properly trained technicians to safely operate their lab. when Wuhan scientists were asking for more support to get the lab up to standards. The U.S. diplomats wrote 2 messages to Washington, D.C., reporting on their visits to the Wuhan lab. More should be done to help the lab meet top safety standards, they said, and they urged Washington to get on it. They also warned that the WIV researchers had found new bat coronaviruses that could easily infect human cells and which used the same cellular route that had been used by the original SARS coronaviruses. Taken together, these 2 points, a particularly dangerous group of viruses being studied in a lab with real safety problems, were intended as a warning about a potential public health crisis. The U.S. diplomats kept the messages to Washington unclassified because they wanted more people back here to be able to read and share them. But there was no response from the State Department, and they were not made public. American diplomats soon lost access to labs such as the one at the WIV. Secretary of State Pompeo wanted, as long as he could, keep good relations with China, and these new revelations would make that job more difficult. President Trump and President Xi had agreed via phone call to halt the war of words that had erupted when a Chinese diplomat alleged on Twitter that the outbreak might have been caused by the U.S. Army. That prompted President Trump to start calling it the China virus, and he still does to this day. President Xi had warned President Trump in that call that China's level of cooperation on releasing critical equipment in America's darkest moment would be jeopardized by continued accusations. Just months into the pandemic, many in our government already believed the virus had escaped from the WIV lab rather than having leaped from an animal to a human at a Wuhan seafood market or some other random natural setting, as the Chinese government had claimed. Any theory of the pandemic's origins had to account for the fact that the outbreak of the original coronavirus first appeared in Wuhan on the doorstep of the lab that possessed one of the world's largest collections of bat coronaviruses, and that it also possessed the closest known relative of SARS, a virus that Xia, again known as the Batwoman, identified in her lab. By April of 2020, U.S. officials at the National Security Council and the State Department had begun to compile circumstantial evidence that the WIV lab, rather than the seafood market, was actually the source of the virus. But the officials couldn't say that out loud because there wasn't firm proof. And if the U.S. government accused China of lying about the outbreak without firm evidence, Beijing would surely escalate tensions even more, which meant that the Americans might not get the medical supplies that were desperately needed to combat rapid spread of COVID-19 in the United States. In May of 2020, Chinese CDC officials declared on Chinese state media that they had ruled out the possibility that the seafood market was the origin of the virus, completely abandoning the original official story. A key argument of the Chinese and American scientists disputing the lab accident theory is that Chinese researchers had performed their work out in the open and had disclosed the coronavirus research they were performing. This argument was used to attack anyone who didn't believe the Chinese scientists' firm denials that their labs could possibly have been responsible for the outbreak. What those in the know were worried about was something called gain-of-function research, in which the transmission of dangerous pathogens are deliberately increased. The purpose is to help scientists predict how viruses might evolve in ways that hurt humans before it happens in nature. But by bypassing pathogens' natural evolutionary cycles, these experiments create risks of a human-made outbreak if a lab accident were to occur. The Wuhan Institute of Virology had openly participated in gain-of-function research in partnership with U.S. universities and institutions. To what extent is unknown. But the U.S. government had evidence that Chinese labs were performing gain-of-function research on a much larger scale than was publicly disclosed, meaning they were taking more risk in more labs than anyone outside China was aware of. Some U.S. officials believe the WIV lab in China was likely conducting coronavirus experiments on mice well before the coronavirus outbreak, research they hadn't disclosed. The State Department alleged that although the Wuhan Institute of Virology disclosed some of its participation in gain-of-function research, it has not disclosed its work with mice, and I quote from the State Department, has engaged in classified research, including laboratory animal experiments, on behalf of the Chinese military since at least 2017, end quote. New revelations about how Chinese labs were handling dangerous coronaviruses in ways their Western counterparts didn't know about led some U.S. officials to become increasingly convinced that Chinese authorities were manipulating scientific information to fit their narrative. But there was so little transparency, it was and still is impossible for the U.S. government to prove one way or the other. Now, the new Biden administration is walking a tightrope, calling on Beijing to release more data. The origin story remains entangled both in domestic politics and U.S.-China relations. Last month, in February of 2021, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, issued a statement expressing deep concerns about a forthcoming report from a team assembled by the World Health Organization that toured Wuhan, even visiting the lab, but was denied crucial data by the Chinese authorities. So there you have it. A little more than a year ago, we were just getting started with trying to combat coronavirus in the United States. Now vaccines are being distributed, but we are no closer to knowing for sure how it all started. Well, thank you for watching. If you like what I'm covering, please click the thumbs up and subscribe. Until we meet again, please be safe.